It's the 2022 World Cup. It's Denmark's players. Hello and welcome to the International Soccer Preview by Soccerphiles Canada. I'm Kevin, and today we'll be looking at Denmark's squad for the 2022 World Cup. The end of the player-by-player part of the podcast. And so we're going to go back to some of our discussion notes from the beginning of the podcast. So these were takeaways from the previous podcast that we did. And these are kind of focused on the team or the squad. So we said that they do well if they reach the tournament. I won't repeat all of that stuff here. But generally, if they reach the tournament, they tend to do well in the tournament. So a good sign for them getting past the group stage here. They've been at a peak of form since 2016. We talked a bit about that too. And we also talked about them being galvanized by the injury or the heart attack of Christian Eriksen. That seemed to bring them together in the 2020 Euro Cup, and they are a pretty tight team, and that was half of my reason for saying that. Not only a tight team, but brought together by that difficulty. Now, throughout the player-by-player podcast, we've noted that a lot of players have been with Brentford in England. So actually, Brentford is owned by a person. He's actually a bit of a mysterious figure called Matthew Benham. And Matthew Benham also owns the Danish club of Midtjylland. In addition to that, the manager of Brentford is Danish, so is bringing in a lot of Danish players, kind of calling them together, as it were. So we have 7 Danes who are on the roster now, and then a few more of them, like Christian Eriksen, have come and gone. So it almost feels like a little Denmark in the Premier League there. And this creates further tightness as a national team, since the players are playing with each other and training with each other all the time. So a call to arms at Brentford, perhaps helping the team, perhaps helping the team's performance. Finally, when we were looking at formations, we noted that their preferred setup is a, whoops, I got that wrong here on the graphic, is a 3-4-2-1. So 3 at the back, 4, so 2 central midfielders and 2 wingers on the defensive end of the midfield, and then 2 attacking midfielders on the right and left side, and 1 forward. So it sometimes does vary. We've seen a 4-1-4-1 and a 4-3-3, and we've also recently seen a formation that was a 4-2-3-1 and allowed Christian Eriksen to play as an attacking midfielder. And since he came back in March, I wonder if they might try out that formation a little bit too, rather than having him play out of position. Okay, well, actually, that was the notes section for the club. We've mentioned all of their clubs in the play-by-play, in the player-by-player discussion, but we'll just kind of summarize it here. So we have quite a few players playing abroad. In fact, most of them kind of play for Brøndby or Copenhagen, and then try to move on to a bigger club in Europe. So we have Kasper Schmeichel, who was playing for Leicester City, now has moved on to Nice in France. But Yannick Vestergaard remains at Leicester City. And, these aren't necessarily the top English clubs, but they are near the top. Andreas Christensen was with Chelsea, which is kind of a top English club. But we do have Martin Braithwaite. He was with Barcelona. I think he moved on to Espanyol in Spain. So actually, it kind of seems like some of them have, some of the aging players have kind of moved on from some of the bigger clubs too. But nevertheless, big clubs in Spain, Italy, Ajax in the Netherlands, uh, um, but perhaps not the biggest clubs in those countries, but more like the second tier teams in those countries. Um, in a lot of cases. Okay, let's move on from that. So, a pretty good club affiliation, but I wouldn't say as good as, say, some of the French team, some of the other teams that are in this cup. Nevertheless, their good club affiliation is part of the reason that they've been doing better. We saw a peak of form since 2016. So part of the reason they've been doing better. Okay, well, if you've listened to other podcasts, you'll know I'm running kind of some statistics on the teams as we go through them. So one of the things we've been looking at is how many players have been called up since 2020, or kind of how many players are on the table for Denmark to be dealing with. And we've seen some countries, Mexico and USA, for example, still have more than 60 players that they have on the table, but Denmark not so many at 45. In fact, it's lower than average. The average is 53, so a manageable number of players for Denmark. And then the total number of players kind of under more serious consideration is 34. So they have to reduce the squad to 26. So that would mean that 8 of the players that we considered would have to be dropped from the team. And again, the average there is 36. So they are slightly below average, and it shouldn't be hard for them to reduce the team to 26 players. Finally, we have kind of definite candidates or likely candidates. And for Denmark, that's 19. So 19 players seem certain to reach the cup. There's always a couple of surprises, late players coming in, or maybe players getting injured. So, basically, if we minus 34 from 19, they have to add 7 of those 15 players to come up with their final squad, give or take a couple for unusual circumstances, like players showing great form in the 3 weeks before the cup or something like that. So a pretty manageable situation for the Danish manager there. Some teams really have a headache in terms of selection. The actual number of definite or likely candidates is lower than average. 22 seems to be the average. But it looks like in central defense or among the forwards, for example, that still a few decisions to be made. Okay, moving on to their average age. Denmark has an average age of 26.8, so that is a little on the high end, but kind of in range. 25 to 27 is average, and they are a little bit on the high end of that. So we have Kasper Schmeichel at 35 years old, and Simon Kerr and Daniel Wass both 33. So they're getting up there. And in all, we have 10 players who are 30 or older. So that is 10 of the 34 players in the possible, likely, or definite category. On the other end of the scale, we only have 4 players who are 22 years old or younger, and 7 that are 23 years old or younger. So they tend to be a bit of an older team. And it looks like they'll probably have to do a bit of refreshment after the World Cup, because I imagine some of these players will be retiring after the World Cup. The average number of caps kind of goes hand in hand with that. So they are at 31.7. Oh, sorry, I didn't write the average age. So 26.8 for the average age, 31.7 for the average number of caps, and that's a bit higher than average, which is 29.5. So it makes sense if the team is a bit older, they have a few caps. Now, I don't consider Denmark a high scoring team, but actually the stats here are quite high. They have 139 goals among those 34 players, and the average is 4.2 per player. So both of those are actually higher than average, which surprised me. I guess in Euro qualification, they have been scoring quite a bit. I'd have to look specifically at their tournaments, but I don't consider them a very high scoring team. But if we look at their forwards, I did talk in the player by player about some of the forwards kind of not delivering the number of goals that they should. Christian Eriksen has a goal ratio of 33%, which is quite good. He's not a centre forward, though. He's more of an attacking midfielder. And we have, surprisingly, the left back, Joachim Mile, at 31%. So that's an incredible ratio for left back. He has 9 goals in 29 games. And right attacking midfielder, Andreas Skov Olsen, the reason he's kind of taken over that position is his good goal ratio at 33% also, so 7 goals in 21 games. Jonas Wind has 5 goals in 15 games, so not really enough games to say that he's a high scorer, but that's pretty good. But he's the only one among the forwards who have that kind of a ratio. So again, I was surprised that Kasper Dolberg wasn't used more after a good performance in the Euro Cup. He's at 28.5% in terms of goals. And I guess the reason that their number of goals is quite good is because they do tend to get goals from all over the field rather than from their centre forwards. So the centre forwards not really scoring as much as they should be, but other players scoring. We saw the left defender there with quite a few more goals than defenders usually get, and even Thomas Delaney, a central midfielder, chipping in with goals, and Højbjerg, kind of goals from all over the field for Denmark. So actually that looks good because they didn't seem a high-scoring team in my mind. Okay, let's look at some players and issues. So one I mentioned with Kasper Schmeichel, he's played all of their games in and since the Euro Cup. So while that's good, I wonder if it has a bad side in that the backup keepers aren't getting enough field time with the national team. So what I worry there is if Schmeichel has an injury or some problem, that the backup keepers are not very experienced, especially with the national team. So perhaps a bit of an over-reliance on Kasper Schmeichel as the keeper. The central defence has been rotating, especially since Simon Kjær was injured. We're not dead sure about Kjær's situation, but it looks like he would come back before the Cup. And that would kind of make 4 central defenders rotating 3 positions, because they usually use a 3-man back line. So how is that going to be in the Cup? Will it be kind of a consistent group, or will there be more rotation? So my guess is that Vestergaard would be the one to go from the starting lineup if Simon Kjær returns. But they do have other players kind of coming into that central defence, sometimes a left back or a right back. In the middle of the field, they were pretty steady with Højbjerg and Delaney. in the Euro Cup, and I believe in World Cup qualifying. But since then, they've kind of rotated quite a few players in and out of the central midfielder. So just a question as to whether Norgard or Jensen have made inroads into the team and will make up part of that central defense, central midfield. Will it be kind of a rotating position or a steady pairing there? We've seen that on the wings, it's mostly the defensive backs, the right back and left back, who are moving up to play in the winger role. So that 3-4-2-1 formation, which they've used more than other formations, has these outside backs playing as wingers, but it doesn't actually allow for the central attacking midfielder, which we'll get to in a second. Is this a decision they've come to, that they'll go within the cup, or will they change up the position in the cup? Well, they did change up the position once recently in the Nations League, to make a central attacking midfielder position, which is Christian Eriksen's nominated position. He's kind of been wandering around the field a couple of times as a right central midfielder, and once I think as a attacking left midfielder, but his actual position is an attacking midfielder, probably in the center. So will they change up that formation to allow for his position to be used? And finally, in the forward line, who is going to be the starting centre forward? So Kasper Dolberg did well in the Euro Cup, but then wasn't used much after that, and they've gone with Cornelius and sometimes Wind. Neither of those have particularly strong scoring records as a centre forward. So I feel like they're kind of still looking for a starting centre forward in this case. They've also used Braithwaite in that position, and Poulsen. I don't think I mentioned in the player-by-player, but Poulsen has been starting as centre forward, actually more than anyone else. But again, he's a right winger, not kind of an out and out forward. So a bit of a question as to who will be the starting centre forward. Let's look at some of their new players coming in. Actually, most of them haven't made solid inroads into the team since the Euro Cup, although a couple of players who got their start in the Euro Cup and now solidly in the team, like Joachim Mail, the left back. Rasmus Christiansen has made inroads. We think he's going to be a definite candidate to reach the cup, to reach the final squad, but not necessarily a starter on that final squad. But he's a new name to the team, who has made fairly good inroads. Alexander Ba, just a possible candidate, and actually all of the ones I'll mention from here on in are just possible candidates. So they've played some games for the cup, but haven't really secured a position for themselves. Philip Billing with Bournemouth in England is a possible candidate who would be new to the squad. Jacob Brun-Larsen, a left winger. I think he started a couple of times as an attacking midfielder. Again, hasn't really made his way into the squad. But all of these have fairly good club affiliations. Alexander Ba, for example, plays for Denmark. Rasmus Christiansen for Leeds United. Brun-Larsen plays for Hoffenheim, and Mohamed Darimi is with Ajax in Netherlands. He's new to the squad and is a left winger, but hasn't really secured a spot for himself, so just a possible candidate. And finally, Jesper Lindström, an attacking midfielder who plays for Eintracht Frankfurt in Germany, making his way into the squad. So these are some of the younger players. Mohamed Darimi, the youngest, just 20 years old. In terms of injury, Simon Carr has a muscle injury, so the captain of the team and one of the starting central defenders until his injury. He got a muscle injury and wasn't available for the games in June. He also didn't play for his clubs in June, but I think he may have played for his club since then, which leads me to think that he will be back in time for the World Cup. But a muscle injury for Simon Carr, so a bit of a doubt now. So we will update this in the update podcast. Yusuf Poulsen also was out with a muscle injury for the last match there in June. But last I checked, he was listed as having influenza rather than a muscle injury, so it wouldn't take him 3 months to recover from that. So Yusuf Poulsen will presumably be back and available for the World Cup too, but he did miss the last match there in June. And finally, and perhaps a bit more seriously, Jonas Wind. And this is a recent thing. I think it was in August that he picked up this hamstring injury and has an unknown return date. And I have seen players return fairly quickly from hamstring injuries, so there seem to be different kinds. But in my mind, a hamstring injury is kind of a longer term injury. And because he has an unknown return date, looks like probably among the three players we've talked about, the least likely of those to be available for the Cup. But of course, as a likely candidate, they'll be hoping that he'll recover from that. Okay. Let's go through some of the notable absences here. And I'm thinking here in terms of people who follow the team from World Cup to World Cup. So I'm including, players or people who were involved in the last World Cup but haven't been that much involved soon. It may be that they were involved in Euro 2020 or else were off the team even by that time. But we begin with manager. And sorry about the pronunciation, but is it Age Harid? He was the manager for the 2018 World Cup, but was replaced in 2020. So he is no longer with them. Jonas Lossell was the backup keeper in the 2018 World Cup and 2020 Euro Cup, but he seems to have been replaced now, last appearing in September 2021. So it doesn't look like he'll be playing backup to Kasper Schmeichel there. In the play-by-play, we talked about Matthias Jorgensen, or Zanka Jorgensen. He's still playing at the club level for Brentford, where quite a few Danish players are. But as far as the national team goes, he hasn't appeared since the 2021 Euro Cup. Henrik Dalsgaard also no longer on the team. He last appeared in November 2020. He was a starter in the 2018 World Cup, but wasn't selected for the Euro 2020 Cup there. William Christ, we actually didn't talk about him in the player-by-player review, but William Christ was on the team from 2007 to 18 and had 84 caps with the national team, and he was a starter in the 2018 World Cup, but he got injured in game one in that tournament, so basically was out for the rest of the tournament. Actually, that was a nasty foul by Peru's Jefferson Farfane, I remember it, that left him with 2 broken ribs and a punctured lung. And really, he did play after that, but no, he didn't play after that. The World Cup was his last tournament there at 33 years old. Lasse Schoen with Denmark from 2009 to 21 with 51 caps, but he last appeared in March 2021. So he was on the World Cup squad in 2018, but not in the Euro 2020 squad. And we did talk about Pione Sisto who we actually have as a possible but unlikely candidate for this cup. He was a starter in the World Cup, although he lost his starting position there in 2018, and he wasn't selected for Euro 2020, but he did play a few games after Euro 2020. So, or he was called up a couple of times, I should say. He only subbed in for one game as far as field time goes. And finally, we have Nikolai Jorgensen. I consider him kind of part of their ongoing search for a starting forward. So he's still playing in Denmark. No, he's unattached right now, still playing at the club level. But he's only 31 years old, but has been off the team since June 2019. So he was a starter in the World Cup, but he lost his starting position there. So all of those players, none of them kind of huge losses to the team there. Some of them veterans with the team for a long time, but none of them real superstars for the team in that notable absence category. Okay, we're going to just finish off here by going back over the squad and predicting starters for the squad. And yeah, we used to predict substitutes, but now we kind of think anyone who's named as a likely candidate, but a likely or definite candidate, but not a starter, will obviously be a substitute. So we won't spend too much time talking about substitutes, but I will name the definite and possible candidates and then predict the starter among them if I can. So manager Kasper Hjulmand, we doubt they'll change their manager before the World Cup here, so it looks like he'll be leading them through the World Cup. We'll call him a starter. Kasper Schmeichel will definitely be the starter, and if he isn't, they're going to have a bit of a problem because they don't have any likely candidates. They haven't really developed a backup keeper for the national team, so a couple of possible candidates there, but no likely candidates to mention, and Kasper Schmeichel as the starter there. Central defenders is usually a three-man back line, and it's kind of been rotated around four players. That's partly because of the injury to captain Simon Kjær. And so my guess is that Simon Kjær will return, so I'm going to call him a starter. Andreas Christensen has probably been the most consistent as far as starts go. And I'm going to say Joachim Andersen as the starter. And I think Simon Kjær will replace Yannick Vestergaard, although I wouldn't be at all surprised if it's rotated a bit and Yannick Vestergaard does get a couple of starts. So those are the four candidates. Andreas Christensen is definite, Yannick Vestergaard and Joachim Andersen as likely, and Simon Kjær as possible because of his injury and because he didn't play any games in June, although really I secretly think that he is a likely to definite candidate depending on fitness. Left back, we have just one definite candidate, Joachim Mail. So he has nailed down that position, and there is a backup possible candidate. But to be honest, when it's not Joachim Mail, it's usually someone playing out of position rather than the possible candidate who's a left back. So maybe someone like Jens Stryger Larsen, who we okay, I'll go back to right back position. So we have Rasmus Christensen as a definite candidate to make the squad, but I don't think he's necessarily a starter for the squad. So I'm going to nominate Daniel Wass as the starter there, and Jens Stryger Larsen, who is also a likely candidate. I think he'll play backup as a left back. Rather than being a starter as a right back. But I don't think either he or Rasmus Christensen are starters. In the defensive midfielder, We have Christian Norgard as a possible candidate to make the team. I'm actually pretty sure he will make the team because they sometimes use him as a more defensive central midfielder, but not a starter. I think the starting central midfielder will be the definite candidates of central midfielder, Thomas Delaney and Pierre-Emile Højbjerg. I would even put Højbjerg ahead of Delaney there. And we also have a likely candidate in Matthias Jensen, but I don't see him as a starter. They have a shockingly few left midfielders, right midfielders, and none of those look like starters. And as far as left wingers and right wingers go, they've been using them more as attacking midfielders or outside forwards. But we do have a couple of candidates who look like starters there. Mikkel Damsgaard is a left winger who we consider definite, and I do see him as a starter. I'm not so sure, though, about Yusuf Poulsen. Actually, if he is a starter, I see him more likely as starting in the centre forward role than in the left winger position that he's designated for. But I'm not confident enough to say that he will be a starter. I think he will start some games, but I kind of think it'll be rotated. Trying to look for a good performer. On the right side, though, the right attacking midfielder, Andreas Skov Olsen has done a fabulous job of locking down the position since the Euro Cup. He wasn't a starter in the Euro Cup. Now I'm trying to think of whether he was in the Euro Cup at all. But anyway, he's done very well coming into the position. So he kind of locked down that position. I think he'll be a starter. And attacking midfielder, Christian Eriksen. Well, they haven't really been using the attacking midfielder position that much. And yet, how can you not put Christian Eriksen on the field as a starter? So I think he'll be somewhere, although a bit of doubt as to the formation and where he will actually be. And then among the forwards, we do have like a definite candidate in Andreas Cornelius. I think he might start a game or two, but I don't think he's what they're hoping for in a centre forward. And we have likely candidates in Martin Braithwaite, who actually played as a right attacking midfielder more, and Jonas Wind, who's an injury doubt. But I'm not confident enough to say either of those are starters. After the World Cup or after the Euro 2020, I would have guessed Kasper Dolberg, but to my surprise, they didn't use him that much as a forward. So I think they'll be searching for their starting centre forward, and I can't nominate any of these forwards or Yusuf Poulsen, who sometimes starts there, as the starter. So I think that's up in the air, perhaps depending on the form of these players as they come into the cup. So we may be able to provide a bit of an update when we do our update podcast in November. But from right now, it looks more like an uncertainty. All right, well, that brings us to the end of the podcast of Denmark's players. And as I just said, we will be updating in November as new information comes out. They're going to publish preliminary rosters and then reduce that to final rosters. So we'll probably do the podcast when the final rosters come out. Meanwhile, keep an eye on us at Soccerphiles Canada. That is Soccerphiles with a PH in the middle and an S at the end. And our Soccerphiles our website is written there on soccerphiles.captivate.fm, and I've been improving the show notes, so you can use the show notes to find links and information and navigation through this podcast. So thanks so much for listening, and we will see you next time. Bye-bye.